A white passenger lashed out at a teen for singing to his baby. Then a sudden click behind him made the entire cabin go silent. A white passenger punched the teen for singing to his baby. Thinking no one would stop him, he didn't realize a click sounded behind his head, signaling the father was about to act with unstoppable precision. The moment that fist landed, the cabin froze in shock. Subscribe. If you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority rises. Milo's giggle rang out softly just seconds after the seatbelt sign blinked off. Raylan Ward, 17, turned his head slightly, lips curving into a tired smile as he cradled his 8-month-old baby brother against his chest. The quiet joy in Milo's sound seemed to ripple outward in the cabin of Aerisline Flight 327, a small but welcome relief in a space filled with recycled air and stiff politeness. The aircraft had just leveled into cruise altitude, and everything, at least for now, seemed stable. But 2 rows behind, a sharp shift in tone was already beginning. Braden Kolst, a broad-shouldered man with thick arms folded tight across his chest, twitched in his seat like someone trying not to explode. He tilted his head forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as if the soft giggle from a child was a personal offense. A single muscle pulsed at his jawline. He said nothing yet, but his glare cut forward, sharp and unrelenting, aimed directly at the back of Raylan's head. Raylan didn't see it. His attention was solely on Milo, who began to whimper, soft, uncertain sounds of discomfort. Raylan responded without hesitation. He began to hum. The tune was simple, something his father used to sing when nights were long and the electricity failed back home. A melody passed between men in his family for years, quiet, low, and full of gentle rhythm. The sound spilled into the narrow rows with barely more volume than the cabin fan. It was more breath than note. Passengers nearby turned their heads, not in annoyance but in calm acknowledgement. An elderly man nodded once. A middle-aged gentleman across the aisle exhaled, his shoulders easing into the seat. The hum had a peace to it, unexpected, almost welcome. Except for Braden. Braden's eyes widened just slightly as if insulted by the very air the sound traveled through. He shifted in his seat again, this time aggressively, elbow thudding against the armrest in an unnecessary motion. He turned his face and muttered something sharp under his breath. Across the aisle, Taran Vesk adjusted his posture in silence. Taran had noticed Braden the moment the man boarded. There had been a stiffness in the way Braden scanned the cabin, a possessiveness in how he marked his row, and a simmer in his body that suggested his patience had a thin, worn edge. Taran didn't like that kind of energy, not in closed spaces. He wasn't dressed in anything official today, just a simple gray-collared shirt and dark jeans. He'd chosen a window seat, angled with purpose, and now he was watching. Raylan kept humming. Milo calmed slowly in his arms, head resting beneath his brother's chin, eyes fluttering with sleep. Raylan exhaled. He didn't notice the gathering pressure behind him, nor the tightrope of mood that had begun to stretch. He didn't hear Braden mutter again. Why won't he shut up? Taran did. The tone wasn't frustration. It was something more targeted, something personal. Taran angled his eyes forward without turning his head. Braden's hand clenched once on his tray table, then released. He shifted his knee outward just enough to jostle the man beside him. Passive, controlled, but loaded. Meanwhile, Raylan reached for a small toy clipped to Milo's carrier strap, giving it a soft squeak to make the baby smile. Milo responded with another tiny giggle, a laugh of pure innocence. That was the sound that triggered it. Braden stiffened like he'd been slapped. He sat up, his back pressed harshly against the seat. Taran saw his nostrils flare. Braden leaned forward again, just slightly, but enough to scan between the gaps in the seats. His eyes locked onto the back of Raylan's neck. The boy's curls shifted as he leaned to kiss Milo's head, unaware he was under scrutiny. Taran's gaze narrowed. Braden's foot began tapping uncontrollably. There was no music, no rhythm, just irritation, rising, unchecked. Inside Raylan, though, the moment felt light. Milo had calmed. That meant everything. Traveling with the baby was no easy task, especially alone. The boy had worried all morning about this flight. Milo didn't take well to strangers, and airports weren't made for young teens with strollers and boarding passes in one hand and a crying infant in the other. But now, Milo was nestled in his arms, and the lullaby had worked. He closed his eyes briefly, whispering, "Good job, buddy. Just sleep now, okay?" The seatbelt light above dimmed slightly as the plane settled into cruise rhythm. But behind him, the real turbulence was just beginning. Braden's breathing had grown audible, tight through the nose, jaw grinding at the molars. He muttered a third time, this time louder, though not loud enough to be clear. The man next to him glanced uneasily, leaning away. Taran placed his hand on his knee, calm, ready, but coiled. His fingers tapped once against his jeans, a slow diagnostic of timing. He didn't know who Raylan was, but he didn't need to. The situation was setting itself like a trap. All it needed was a trigger. Braden's hand flexed. Milo stirred again. Raylan resumed his humming, soft, melodic, oblivious to the coil of rage forming 2 rows behind him. He shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting Milo's weight. As he did, his face turned just enough to catch a glimpse of movement behind him. Braden shifting again, elbow banging the side wall, face twisted in restrained disgust. Raylan froze for half a second, then turned back. Don't engage, he thought. Just focus on Milo. But his heartbeat ticked faster. Something about the man's face made Raylan uneasy. He tightened his grip on Milo, not enough to frighten, just enough to center himself. Taran watched it all in stillness. And then, from deep in the silence, Milo giggled again. Soft, joyful, pure. It was the most harmless sound in the world, and it was the moment the entire cabin tilted toward something no one could yet name. A calm beginning often hides the storm that waits beneath. Stop making that noise. The words sliced through the air like a sudden gust, sharp and cold. Braden Cols's voice was loud enough to turn a few heads in nearby rows, his tone edged with irritation that felt too intense for such a quiet request. Raylan Ward looked up, startled, his soft humming to baby Milo still lingering in the space between them. The melody he had been singing was barely audible, a lullaby more whispered than sung, something his father used to hum on stormy nights, something that made Milo's little hands unclench and his breathing slow. But now, that gentle sound had triggered something in the man seated 2 rows behind. Raylan's face flushed as several passengers turned in their seats, not quite sure if they were witnessing a misunderstanding or the beginning of something worse. "I'm sorry," Raylan said quickly, voice low and steady, though his fingers instinctively pressed Milo closer to his chest. "He gets upset if I stop." Braden didn't answer immediately. He just stared. His lips were slightly parted, his teeth clenched behind them. Then, without another word, he twisted roughly in his seat, the old leather squeaking beneath his weight. For a moment, Raylan thought that was the end of it. Maybe the man had just been stressed. Maybe the flight had him on edge. But Milo, perhaps sensing the tension or simply returning to his own infant rhythm, let out a soft cry and began squirming. His small fists batted the air, and his lip curled with the unmistakable tremble that always came before a full wail. Raylan gently rocked him, humming the tune again, slower now, willing the calm to return. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft leveled off. The clouds outside had given way to steady skies, but inside the cabin, pressure was quietly building. Braden jerked forward again, this time unbuckling his seatbelt in one swift, exaggerated motion. The clink of the metal latch echoed louder than it should have. He rose halfway, peering over the row in front of him like a predator catching sight of a target. "You deaf?" he snapped. "I said stop it." Raylan's throat tightened. He didn't respond right away. unsure if speaking would calm or provoke the man further. Milo whimpered louder, beginning to cry in earnest now, the confusion of too many faces and sounds making his distress build. A few rows away, heads turned more openly this time. A man in the aisle seat across from Braden narrowed his eyes but didn't speak. He just observed, calculating. That man was Taran Vesk. "Sir," a firm but even-toned voice interjected from mid-cabin. Flight attendant Joran Kale appeared, his presence calm, his uniform sharp. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'm going to need you to take your seat." Braden didn't look at Joran. He pointed instead, his thick arm arched over the seat back, finger extended directly at Raylan. "He's disturbing the cabin. That's a violation." "I paid for quiet." "He's singing to a baby," Joran replied smoothly. "It's not a disturbance. I still need you seated. The captain hasn't turned off the sign." The scowl on Braden's face shifted from anger to something more calculating. His jaw tightened. His hand slowly curled into a fist before falling back to his side as he lowered himself into the seat. But even as he sat down, it was clear the fire inside him had not dimmed. Taran Vesk remained still, his body angled so he could see both Braden and the young teen with the baby. His right leg rested lightly across his knee, but his eyes were sharp and unblinking. He had seen this pattern before, small confrontations that looked like nothing until they suddenly turned into something irreversible. He watched Braden's shoulders, watched his breath quicken, watched his fingers twitch against his jeans. Raylan, meanwhile, tried once again to comfort Milo. His hands were steady, but the back of his neck was burning. He could feel Braden's glare like a spotlight, unrelenting and irrational. He wanted to believe that apologizing again would help, but part of him, some instinct born from the look in that man's eyes, knew otherwise. "I'm just trying to calm him," Raylan whispered down to Milo, his voice trembling now. "We're almost there, bud. Just a little longer." The melody returned, softer than before, but somehow more strained, less a song now and more a shield. It carried the weight of desperation, the quiet pleading of a brother trying to protect what mattered most with the only thing he had, his voice. Behind them, Braden's knuckles turned white. He muttered something again. Not loud, but not soft enough to be missed. "This is what's wrong with everything," he hissed, voice laced with bitterness. "They let kids ruin everything. Noise everywhere. No rules anymore." Joran glanced back once, his face expressionless. He didn't engage. He was trained not to. Taran, however, didn't glance at all. He just shifted his boot forward an inch, adjusting his angle. Every movement Braden made was met with quiet calculation. Every twitch of his jaw, every inch of tension in his forearms registered. And Braden was clearly waiting for something. A reason, an excuse, a moment. Raylan didn't know that. He only saw his baby brother's eyes growing wider, his hands reaching out to cling to the collar of his hoodie. Milo tucked his face into the crook of Raylan's neck, trying to hide. That small act pierced something in Raylan's chest. He wasn't just trying to stay calm anymore. He was preparing. He wasn't sure for what, but the weight of it was pressing down fast. He looked up slowly, scanning the cabin. Several passengers were watching now. Some leaned into their armrests, others sat stiff, unsure if they should speak or wait. The tension was rising like steam in a sealed room. Joran moved back into the aisle, subtly closer to Braden, his earpiece quietly active. Taran hadn't moved his gaze, and Braden, now quiet again, leaned back into his seat, but not in surrender. There was something different in the way his body rested, like a snake coiling instead of retreating. The baby made a soft sound again, a hiccup of a sob, and Raylan hummed again, almost involuntarily, as if the sound might stitch the moment back together. Braden's eyes opened wide. The next time he moved, it wouldn't be to speak, but not yet. At that moment, Joran stepped forward again and gave one last warning. "Sir," he said firmly, "don't do anything you'll regret." and somewhere deeper in the cabin, a passenger whispered, "Something's wrong with that man." But it was too late. The tension was already baked into the air. Raylan held Milo tighter, his heart hammering in his chest. Pressure always reveals the true shape of a man's intentions. Braden rose so suddenly that the fabric of his seat groaned beneath him, the motion sharp enough to break the uneasy silence that had settled over the cabin. His shadow fell across the aisle as he pushed forward, each step stiff with anger he no longer cared to hide. Raylan felt the air shift behind him before he heard anything, a cold prickle climbing the back of his neck as Milo whimpered against his chest. The teen hummed out of instinct, hoping the soft tune would settle the baby, but the trembling in his own voice betrayed his nerves. "I warned you," Braden snapped, his voice low but harsh, slicing through the murmurs of nearby passengers. His hands were balled into fists, knuckles pale, shoulders hunched like a man bracing for impact he intended to create. Joran Kale started toward him, alarm flashing in his eyes, but Braden had already closed half the distance. Raylan turned just as Braden's form loomed over them. "Please, he's just scared," Raylan said, his voice hushed, throat tight, trying to protect both Milo and the fragile piece around them. But Braden wasn't listening. The fury in his expression had built too long, too quietly, simmering beneath every look and mutter he had buried earlier. Passengers froze. One man half rose from his seat, then stopped, uncertain. Another reached an arm out as if he might intervene, but fear rooted him in place. Dramatic irony wrapped the moment in a chilling truth. Everyone sensed the explosion, but no one knew how to stop it. Braden's fist moved before most could register the motion, a sharp, brutal swing that cracked against Raylan's cheek with a sound that silenced the cabin. Raylan's head snapped sideways, his sight flashing white for a moment as he fell across the seat, curling instinctively to shield Milo. The baby screamed, startled by the sudden violence and the jolt of Raylan's body tightening around him. Pain pulsed through Raylan's cheek, heat blooming beneath the skin. He struggled upright, breath trembling as he whispered, "It's okay, Milo. It's okay," though the words were more prayer than certainty. The baby clung to his shirt, his sobs rising over the ringing in Raylan's ears. Behind them, someone gasped. Another whispered, "Did he just—" But the question faded into shocked silence. Braden drew his arm back again, face twisted with a mixture of anger and self-righteousness, as though he believed the entire cabin should support him. "You should have listened," he muttered, voice shaking from the rush of adrenaline. Raylan's heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear. He shrank over Milo, every instinct focused on shielding the infant even as he braced for a second blow. He could feel Braden's breath, feel the heat of the man's rage pressing closer. Then another sound cut through the moment. A dry, precise metallic click echoed from directly behind Braden. It was not loud, but it carried weight, slicing through the tension with chilling clarity. The cabin stilled in response. Braden froze mid-motion, shoulders stiffening as the meaning of that sound rippled through him. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed looks, their expressions shifting from fear to something else, anticipation, relief, or dread. Raylan, still bent protectively over Milo, heard the click and felt the air around him shift, as though the moment itself had been caught and held in place. He didn't know what the sound meant, only that it carried a promise. Something had changed. Braden's head turned slightly, confusion flickering across his tense features. The murmurs in the cabin fell away again, everyone holding their breath as the atmosphere tightened like a pulled cord on the verge of snapping. And in that suspended moment, Raylan understood one terrifying truth. Whatever happened next would determine the direction of the entire flight. The sound that followed would change the direction of the entire flight. Braden froze. The click was unmistakable, sharp, cold, final. It came from behind him, low in tone but loud enough to carve silence through the aisle. His raised hand, still mid-motion from where he'd nearly struck again, faltered. Slowly, stiffly, he turned his head. Taran Vesk stood there. He had stepped cleanly into the aisle, his posture calm but anchored, both feet planted as if expecting recoil. In his hand was a sleek, matte-black tool, small, square, with a visible pressure spring at the center. It resembled a restraint device used in specialized cabin incidents, non-lethal, yes, but engineered to immobilize swiftly and without debate. Most passengers wouldn't have recognized it. Brayden didn't need to. His instincts did the math. "Step back. Now," Taran said, his voice low and measured, like a line made of steel. Brayden's breath caught. His shoulders twitched. He didn't turn all the way around, didn't dare. The cabin held its breath with him. A hush fell so complete that even Milo's soft whimpering became the loudest sound in the row. Raylan, pressed back into his seat, arms curled around the infant in protective instinct, blinked through the pain in his cheek. He saw Brayden stiffen, saw the flicker of something pale in his eyes. Not fear, exactly. Confusion, disbelief. As if the man couldn't comprehend how quickly the power dynamic had shifted. Flight attendant Joran Kale appeared from the galley with long strides, placing himself just beside the scene, not intervening but hovering with intent. His eyes took in the angle of Brayden's body, the tension in his arms, the precise readiness in Taran's grip. He didn't need to ask what happened. The air spoke for itself. Brayden's hands rose an inch, then another, fingers stiff. "I wasn't going to hurt him," he muttered, eyes darting between Taran's unreadable expression and the device. "No one believes that," Taran said, not raising his voice, not moving an inch closer. His tone did the work. "Back to your seat. Slowly." Behind them, other passengers leaned back with wide eyes. No one reached for their phones. This wasn't the kind of chaos people wanted footage of. This was too real, too close, and the wrong move might ignite something worse. Raylan held Milo tighter. The baby trembled in his arms, his soft curls damp with sweat from crying. Raylan's heartbeat was a fast, painful echo in his ears. His jaw ached where the punch had landed, but his mind locked on one thing: protect Milo. Keep him safe. Stay between Brayden and the baby, no matter what. "Sir," Joran said gently, looking to Taran with a nod before addressing Brayden. "Please return to your seat. We've already informed the cockpit." Brayden glanced down the aisle toward the cockpit. A small red light blinked near the cabin intercom panel, an alert signal. He shifted his weight, but the moment he twitched, Taran angled the restraint tool a fraction higher, enough to erase the idea. "Don't," Taran said. That one word, calm and unshaken, made Brayden flinch more than any threat could have. Brayden exhaled through clenched teeth and stepped back. It wasn't surrender. It was calculation. But it was enough. Joran moved alongside him as Brayden backed into his row, settling into his seat like a man shackled by more than seatbelts. His expression was not one of guilt, it was of resentment. As if everyone around him had failed to see some imaginary insult only he understood. Passengers began breathing again. One man let out a quiet, "Thank God." Another woman dabbed her eyes, whispering something to herself. The cabin had returned to its artificial calm, but now it pulsed with the kind of energy that comes after a narrowly avoided disaster. Raylan leaned his head against Milo's, closing his eyes for a moment. The baby's cries had dulled to soft sobs, fingers clutching his brother's collar like a lifeline. Raylan whispered something, just a broken melody from the lullaby he had tried to sing before it all went wrong. His voice cracked midway, but he didn't stop. Taran took 2 steps back, still in the aisle but no longer threatening. He lowered the tool without holstering it, hand resting calmly over it like a silent warning. He didn't glance at Brayden again. He didn't need to. He was watching everyone else now. The room, the balance, the possible sparks. Joran stepped forward, gently crouched by Raylan's seat. "Are you all right?" he asked, voice careful, not wanting to overwhelm. Raylan nodded, just barely. I think so," Stay there. We've alerted the cockpit. We're preparing to divert. Joran's gaze flicked to the darkening bruise on Raylan's cheek. You're doing everything right. Just hold him. That's all you need to do. Raylan didn't answer. He couldn't. The emotion was a rising tide in his throat. Across the aisle, Braden sat stone-faced, hands on his knees, knuckles white. But his eyes were moving, measuring. Not regretful, not defeated. Watching. Taran caught it. He didn't speak it aloud, but the tension in his shoulders told the story. This wasn't over. As Joran walked briskly toward the front to coordinate with the captain, the soft hum of the intercom clicked on. A calm voice announced a temporary course change, due to a security concern. Passengers exchanged looks, some in hushed tones, but none challenged the decision. And in row 17, Raylan sat holding Milo beneath the air vent, a folded blanket draped loosely across the baby's back. Taran stood only a few feet away, like a shadow that didn't blink. Every movement from Braden was watched, every breath accounted for. There would be no third chance. And though the cabin seemed quiet again, something had shifted, permanently. The cabin had chosen sides, not with noise, not with votes, but with silence, and the silence was no longer neutral. The punch was only the beginning, and the consequences had just taken flight. Braden's fist had barely left Raylan's cheek when the cabin plunged into a stunned, trembling silence. Now, moments later, the aftermath settled like a heavy fog. Braden sat stiffly in his seat, jaw locked, breath shallow. His knuckles still bore the tension of the strike, though his posture suggested a forced calm, not remorse. Across the narrow aisle, Joran Kale stood close, not directly engaging Braden, but keeping a watchful eye, his training evident in the subtle way he blocked any easy path forward. Just behind him, Taran Vesk remained stationed with the restraint tool lowered, but ready, like a sheath half drawn. Raylan hadn't moved far from the position Braden's punch had knocked him into. He was cradling Milo tightly now, one arm wrapping around the infant's back, the other hand pressed gently against the baby's small head. His cheek pulsed with a dull ache that flared whenever he blinked. But he didn't cry, didn't speak. His entire focus was on Milo, who whimpered in hiccuping sobs against his chest. Raylan's voice cracked as he whispered, It's okay, buddy," though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Milo or to himself. A few nearby passengers leaned out of their seats, offering tissues, soft voices, or stunned looks of empathy. An older man, 2 rows up, murmured, "That boy didn't do anything wrong." Another, a younger man with a travel pillow still draped around his neck, simply shook his head and whispered something to his seatmate. The air was thick with the electricity of shared outrage. The act had been public, undeniable. No one could pretend it hadn't happened. The cabin intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came over, firm but composed. "Due to a security disturbance on board, we will be diverting this flight to Varenport Regional for immediate landing. We appreciate your cooperation and calm as we ensure the safety of all passengers." Murmurs broke out instantly. Some passengers exhaled in relief. Others exchanged worried glances. One woman clutched her partner's hand tightly. Braden, however, scoffed aloud and muttered, "Ridiculous," over a song. His voice wasn't loud, but it was bitter enough to cut through the tension like a knife. Joran glanced toward him, his jaw tight. "You'll want to stay quiet now, sir," he said evenly. Braden huffed, but didn't speak again. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, though his fingers twitched on the armrest. Taran hadn't shifted. His gaze never left Braden. He didn't need to say anything. The way he stood, shoulders relaxed but ready, said everything. His eyes were like a storm being held behind glass. Raylan shifted slightly in his seat, brushing a thumb gently against Milo's shoulder. He tried to slow his breathing, tried to piece together what had just happened. His thoughts felt like 1,000 broken glass fragments, sharp and scattered. Across the aisle, Taryn gave him a small nod. It was quick, quiet, but Raylan caught it. A silent message. "You're safe now. I won't let it happen again." Milo's grip tightened on Raylan's shirt. The baby's eyes were still red from crying, his face buried in the soft fabric. Raylan pulled him closer, whispering again, softer now. "I've got you. I've got you." Joran crouched for a moment beside Raylan, voice low. "Can I check your cheek?" Raylan nodded wordlessly. Joran gently tilted Raylan's face to the side, frowning as he examined the swelling. "It'll bruise. I'll have ice brought once we land." His voice had the practiced calm of someone used to emergencies, but Raylan could hear the frustration beneath it. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," Raylan said quietly. Milo, he cries when it's too quiet." "You didn't cause this," Joran said firmly. "You did exactly what any good brother would do." Up front, a flight attendant whispered something to the captain through the closed cockpit door, then turned and hurried down the aisle to speak with ground operations via the interphone. The preparation had begun. Security would be waiting. Brayden shifted in his seat again, casting an uneasy glance toward the rows of watching passengers. His bravado had dimmed, but not vanished. He muttered again, quieter this time, "You're all making a big deal out of nothing." Nobody replied. Nobody needed to. The silence was judgment enough. Taryn's eyes narrowed. He leaned slightly forward as if reading something in Brayden's posture that others couldn't see. He angled his body just enough to give himself a better reaction path. Nothing obvious, but purposeful. Raylan saw it and tensed. He had been through one eruption. He could feel another coming. Whispers filled the rows around them. Some passengers replayed the punch aloud, trying to describe the sound of it. Others debated how it could have gone that far. One man speculated whether Brayden was drunk. Another guessed he just hated babies. But everyone could agree on one thing. Raylan hadn't done anything to deserve it. Still holding Milo, Raylan tried to mentally map out what he'd do if Brayden lunged again. How to curl his body just right, how to angle Milo away. A boy who had boarded the plane hoping only for a peaceful reunion with his father was now running protective strategies in his head. And he wasn't thinking like a child anymore. As the aircraft stabilized in its new course toward Varenport, the seatbelt sign blinked overhead. The descent had begun. Raylan braced unconsciously. Joran tapped his earpiece, listening to the cockpit update. Then he looked toward Taryn and gave a subtle nod. Something in Brayden's posture had changed. He was tapping his foot now, rapidly. His jaw clenched. His knuckles flexed once, then again. Taryn didn't blink. The aircraft was getting closer to the ground, but the true impact hadn't yet landed. And as Brayden leaned slightly forward, shoulders shifting, breath accelerating, Raylan felt a chill at the base of his spine. It was subtle, but it was clear. Brayden wasn't done. The pilot's voice came through again. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." But deep down, he already knew what was coming. But the flight still had miles to go, and Brayden's silence was only a warning, not a surrender. Brayden's fingers twitched against the armrest. Joran Kale noticed it first, not with alarm, but the quiet alertness of a man trained to detect shifts in a room's emotional atmosphere. He watched as Brayden's foot began tapping in uneven rhythms, the sharp motion shaking the floor beneath his seat. Nearby, passengers flinched subtly with each jolt, though none dared to speak. From his corner, Taryn Vesk adjusted his position by a fraction, angling his shoulder to keep both Brayden and Raylan within his peripheral vision. It was the kind of shift that went unnoticed by the average person, unnoticed by Brayden, certainly, but it signaled something unmistakable to those who knew how to read the signs. Raylan sat with his head bowed, Milo tucked securely against his chest. The baby's breath had finally slowed, his tiny body giving in to sleep despite the lingering tension in the cabin. Raylan dared not move. His own cheek still burned from the strike, the outline of Braden's knuckles etched into his skin like a cruel brand. But pain wasn't his priority. Not now. His focus remained fixed on Milo's safety. Every movement, every breath, every thought centered on that fragile weight in his arms. The cabin had grown unnaturally quiet. Even the air felt still, as though the pressure inside the aircraft had frozen into glass. Joran moved with quiet grace, pretending to check the overhead bins, but his eyes never left Braden. He passed close to Raylan's row and offered a subtle nod, confirmation that he was watching, protecting, waiting. Braden exhaled hard through his nose. His shoulders rolled, not to stretch, but to prepare. Taryn saw it immediately. The deepening breath, the micro-tightening of the wrists, the bounce of adrenaline moving through the man's frame like a primed coil. It was a pattern Taryn had studied countless times in field simulations and real-life emergencies. The look of a man who believed he still had control. A man preparing to prove something through force. Raylan felt it too, not fully, but enough. There was a tightening in the air behind him, an invisible knot winding tighter with each second. His mind raced quietly. If he stands up again. If he lunges. Raylan shifted Milo slightly, adjusting the baby's head so it faced inward, shielding his eyes. He knew he was no match for a grown man in brute strength, but he didn't need strength. He needed strategy. He braced one foot forward subtly, just enough to turn his body if needed. His fingers gripped the baby tighter, instinct awakening into action. The seatbelt sign pinged overhead with a chime. Descent had begun. The plane dipped gently, angling toward the Varenport airstrip. Passengers stirred, some exhaling relief, others adjusting tray tables and seatbacks. But no one relaxed. Not fully. Braden's knuckles had gone pale against the armrest. He didn't even flinch at the ping. His eyes were locked ahead, not out the window, not at the cabin crew, but at the teen in the second row, the one who had dared to sing. Taryn leaned slightly forward in his seat. Joran, now closer to the galley, exchanged a look with him. Brief, professional, the kind of glance that carries more information than a full conversation. A silent alert. He's going to try again. Raylan didn't need the look to know. He could feel it, the same way animals sense a storm. He pressed his lips to Milo's forehead, whispering something only the baby could hear. "You're okay. I've got you. I won't let him touch you." Milo stirred faintly in his sleep, his fingers curling into Raylan's shirt. The engines shifted pitch slightly as the plane dropped another 100 feet. Outside, the dusk-colored sky gave way to glimpses of ground lights below, signaling their proximity to the diversion airfield. But inside the cabin, the real descent had already begun. Braden exhaled once more, slow, deliberate, and uncrossed his legs. His heel scraped back along the floor. Then his fingers curled into fists. The calm was a lie now, stretched thin across the surface of something dangerous. It was only a matter of seconds before it shattered. The descent brought the plane closer to safety, but danger was rising right inside the cabin. The jolt of the landing disguised the danger. Braden Kolst had already unlatched his seatbelt. The moment the plane's wheels hit the runway, he sprang upward, his bulky frame lurching down the aisle like a coiled spring finally released. Gasps tore through the cabin, but it all happened too fast for most to react. Raylan Ward didn't have time to think. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He curled protectively over Milo, his arms tightening around the 8-month-old's small frame. The baby whimpered at the sudden movement, eyes wide in fear. Raylan's heart pounded, but his instincts locked in. Shield Milo. That was the only thought. "Get out of the way," Braden barked, his voice rough and furious. Passengers in the aisle seats scrambled. One man tried to lift an arm to stop him, but Braden shoved him aside with brute force. Another voice shouted something, but it was drowned out in the chaos. Joran Kale, the flight attendant, stepped in, placing himself between Braden and Raylan, arms raised in a desperate barrier. "Sir, sit down now," Joran ordered, voice firm. Braden didn't hesitate. His shoulders slammed into Joran's chest, knocking the attendant sideways into an empty seat. Someone screamed, others froze. For a breathless second it seemed Braden would actually reach them. Then Taran Vesk moved. It wasn't loud, it wasn't showy, but it was immediate, like flipping a switch. Taran rose smoothly from his seat, angled just behind Braden, and in one swift pivot, he seized Braden's right arm at the elbow and twisted. Braden bellowed in pain, stumbling off balance. Taran didn't let go. "Enough," he said calmly, almost quietly, but the authority in his voice silenced the cabin more effectively than a scream would have. With the same motion, he pulled a compact restraint device from his pocket and, in a single click and snap, secured Braden's wrists behind his back. The bulky man thrashed once, trying to free himself, but the restraint held fast. His leverage was gone. His momentum shattered. "Sit down." Taran pushed him toward a seat with controlled force. Braden's face flushed red with rage, but his power had evaporated. All that remained was noise, and even that faded under the weight of the passengers' collective relief. Applause burst out from the rows behind, not out of joy, but a kind of shared, shaken gratitude. A passenger muttered, "Thank God someone knew what to do." Another added, "He was going to hurt that kid." Joran, though bruised and rattled, stood back up, brushing off his vest and hurrying to help Taran secure Braden to a vacant row. He fastened the restraint harness and double-checked the position. Raylan, still hunched over Milo, blinked in disbelief, trying to slow his breath. His arms trembled, but he didn't let go. He felt Milo's small hand gripping the front of his shirt, fingers twitching against the soft fabric. "It's okay. It's okay," Raylan whispered, more to himself than to the child. Taran turned slightly, his eyes sweeping the cabin. He scanned the passengers first, ensuring no one else was injured or reacting with panic. Then he looked to Raylan and gave him a slight nod. Reassurance. Calm. Over the intercom, the captain's voice broke in, "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Cabin crew, hold all movements. Ground security is en route to the aircraft. Do not attempt to disembark until instructed." Braden grunted behind the restraint, muttering angry words no one bothered to respond to. His threats now sounded hollow, stripped of the fear he once commanded. Milo's cries resumed, soft but tired. He had reached the limit of what a baby could endure in a single day. Raylan rocked him gently, whispering, humming, anything to give the child a sense of safety again. His own throat ached with unshed emotion, but he refused to cry. Not yet. From across the aisle, a man leaned over and said quietly, "You're brave, kid. You held it together." Raylan didn't answer. He only nodded once, lips pressed into a thin line. Joran checked in again, his voice lower now. "You all right?" "I think so," Raylan replied, finally sitting upright. "Milo's okay. That's all that matters." But his hands still shook. Joran looked at Taran, who remained standing. "How'd you?" "I've done this before," Taran said simply, eyes not leaving Braden. There was something strange in that reply. Quiet, unspoken history, buried beneath the words. Raylan heard it too, though he didn't have the energy to ask. He only clutched Milo closer and let the exhaustion begin to settle in. Braden's head slumped forward, finally accepting the futility of resistance. The fight was gone, but the consequences had only begun. The cabin didn't relax, not completely, but something shifted. The fear had turned into resolve. If Braden thought this flight would end with silence, he had underestimated everyone aboard. And as Raylan kissed Milo's forehead and whispered another lullaby into the air, the tension finally softened just enough for him to breathe. The moment Braden struck again, he lost the last chance he had to walk off that plane unchanged. The passenger smirked, confident his strike would go unchallenged, unaware that every movement, every second, and every witness had already triggered the father's calculated response. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when strategy meets lethal precision, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The aircraft thudded to a full stop near a remote gate, the brakes groaning beneath the weight of everything that had unfolded in the sky above Varenport. A hiss of hydraulic systems cut through the still cabin, but no one moved. Not yet. Tension hovered like thick fog, unspoken and electric, as if everyone on board was waiting to exhale until the last shadow was off the plane. The front cabin door clicked, then cracked open. A gust of air swept in, followed by the heavy boots of ground officers moving with quiet purpose. No one applauded. No one spoke. The sense of relief was too fragile, too raw. Braden Kolst sat hunched and silent in his row, his arms still bound by the restraint device, the metal biting slightly into his skin each time he twitched. His jaw clenched, but the bravado he had displayed earlier was gone. What remained was a brittle confusion, masked by forced indignation. Taran Vesk rose from his position without fanfare. Calm, upright, and unreadable, he stepped toward the officers and handed Braden over. His voice was steady, clear, clinical, unshaken. Male passenger initiated 2 separate assaults, first against the guardian of an infant, second during landing, despite restraint protocols, physical and verbal aggression. Intention to harm was unmistakable. The officers glanced at each other, then back at Taran. One of them, a tall, square-jawed man with a discreet rank patch on his collar, narrowed his eyes and said, "Appreciate the detail, Inspector Vesk." The way he said it turned heads. Whispers rippled across the cabin. Raylan Ward's head slowly lifted from where it had been resting against Milo's. His fingers instinctively tightened around the baby, as though afraid the world might lurch again. The swelling on his cheek had deepened, a stark purpling bruise forming beneath the skin, but he said nothing. He simply watched as the man who had hit him was now being led away. Braden didn't resist, but as he passed Raylan's row, he turned his head sharply. His eyes locked onto the teenagers. There was no apology in them, just a flickering, puzzled fury. The look of a man stunned that his rage had consequences, that a lullaby could have cost him this much. Raylan didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He merely adjusted Milo in his arms, shielding the baby's head from the view of the man who had tried to break their peace. Passengers around them leaned in, patting Raylan's shoulder, offering tissues, quiet words, nods of solidarity. Raylan nodded back faintly, more overwhelmed than he could show. But it was Joran Kale who moved closest, kneeling beside Raylan's seat. "You all right?" Joran asked, his voice gentle but firm. "I think so," Raylan whispered, voice hoarse. "Milo's okay." Joran reached up, checking the bruised cheek with a soft touch. "That's going to hurt for a while," he muttered. "But you did good, son. You held the line." Raylan blinked hard, not trusting himself to speak. Every nerve in his body still buzzed with adrenaline. He felt like something inside him had changed, but he didn't know what yet. Behind them, the officers exited with Braden. The heavy footfalls faded down the jet bridge. One door closed. And then, just as things began to shift toward movement, the lead officer paused. He looked back at Taran and beckoned him aside. The cabin watched in silence as Taran stepped over. The officer's words were too low to be heard, but his posture was unmistakably respectful. He addressed Taran not as a civilian, but as someone with recognized authority. "Didn't expect to find you on this one," he murmured. "But glad you were. Heard about the Keldron case last month. Tight work." "Just happened to be aboard," Taran replied quietly. "Didn't expect the storm either." The officer nodded and walked off. Taran lingered for a moment, then returned to Raylan's row. Raylan looked up at him, wide-eyed. You're an inspector?" the teen asked, voice still hushed. Taran offered a faint nod. "Off duty, technically, but when someone throws a punch at a boy holding a baby, Duty finds you fast. Raylan held his gaze, absorbing that. A quiet understanding passed between them, one built not on admiration, but on shared experience, fear, and resolve. Milo stirred slightly in his arms, his breath uneven but calm. One by one, passengers began standing, slowly gathering their belongings. Joran stayed close to Raylan, offering to help with his backpack. "Let's get you off this plane. You've done more than enough for one day." As Raylan rose with care, his legs shaky beneath him, the cabin felt different. Not just quieter, but changed. The fear that had once hung in the air was replaced with something steadier. Respect, gratitude. Quiet outrage turned into silent support. Step by step, Raylan moved forward, Milo held gently against his chest. The hum of the jet bridge beyond sounded distant, like another world waiting. His cheek throbbed with every heartbeat, but he kept going, never loosening his grip on the baby. Joran walked slightly behind him, and Terran brought up the rear, eyes still scanning, still protective. And as they reached the front of the aircraft, one of the passengers murmured just loud enough for others to hear. "He did nothing wrong. All he did was sing to a baby." The line stuck in the air. Outside, the runway shimmered with heat. The descent was over. The danger was gone. But the story had only just begun. The danger had been taken off the plane, but the story of what happened was only beginning to unfold. Raylan stepped into the private waiting room, still cradling Milo tightly against his chest. The cool air conditioning contrasted sharply with the flushed heat in his cheeks, both from the swelling where Brayden had struck him and the residual shock burning under his skin. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, he paused, not from hesitation, but to silently ensure Milo was breathing calmly, his chest rising and falling against the fabric of Raylan's shirt. The baby's grip on him hadn't loosened since they'd left the aircraft. It was as if Milo's tiny fingers had absorbed every tremor of the plane's chaos and refused to let go. Terran Vesk followed closely, his presence solid, unshakable, like a shadow Raylan hadn't known he needed. The room was simple. 4 chairs, a wide table, a dull overhead light, and yet it felt like the center of the world for now. 2 transport officers entered next, both men in uniform, their faces professional but not cold. One of them, Officer Wren Delmore, carried a tablet and a file folder. The other, Officer Keelan Trask, held a body cam and a standard incident report packet. Neither seemed eager to overwhelm the teen, but the urgency in their posture made it clear. What had happened on that flight was not being taken lightly. "Take your time," Delmore said gently, gesturing to the chair. "You're safe now." Raylan sat slowly, his muscles sore from tension. Milo shifted, letting out a small sound that was halfway between a sigh and a whimper. The baby's exhaustion radiated off him like steam, and Raylan's own eyes burned, not from tears, but from having held them back too long. He adjusted his arms to keep Milo nestled, and then nodded. "I'm ready." Delmore clicked the recorder on and opened the file. "Please state your name for the record." "Raylan Ward," the teen said quietly, voice hoarse. 17 years old? Trask gave a confirming nod, then asked, "Can you tell us what happened from the moment the first incident began?" Raylan took a breath. "It started when I sang to my brother." He told them everything. His voice was steady but low, sometimes catching on words he hadn't expected would sting. How Brayden Kolst had started glaring from behind. How he tried to stay quiet, but Milo kept crying. How humming was the only way to keep the baby from falling apart in that cramped, tense space. And then, how the man stood, shouted, and hit him. Raylan's hand briefly touched his bruised cheek. The swelling had deepened since landing, a thick pulse beneath the skin. When he reached the part about the second attack, the one Brayden attempted just as the plane landed, his voice grew sharper. "He ran at us again. I couldn't move. I just shielded Milo." Trask's eyes narrowed. "You didn't provoke him." Raylan blinked. "No, I was trying to sing softly, just for my brother. He stops crying when I sing." That sentence hung in the air like a stone dropped into water. For a moment, neither officer said a word. Then Delmore slowly wrote something down and spoke without looking up. "So, he attacked you for protecting your brother, with a lullaby." "Yes," Raylan said. "If I didn't sing, Milo would have cried louder. It was the only way." The silence that followed was thicker than before, not uncomfortable, but weighty. Even the baby, half asleep against Raylan's chest, seemed to feel it. Taryn, who had remained standing with arms crossed behind the officers, stepped forward slightly, just enough to cast a quiet shadow over the table. "He did what any good guardian would," Taryn said firmly. "Don't mistake necessity for disobedience." Delmore nodded, lips pressed together, then turned toward his tablet. "We'll be charging Mr. Kolst with physical assault, attempted secondary assault during descent, and obstruction of a secured flight operation. He'll also face charges for endangering a minor's welfare through aggravated conduct." Raylan didn't speak. He only adjusted Milo again, feeling the slow calm return to the baby's breathing. But the storm in his own thoughts had not cleared. The officers continued recording notes and asking brief questions, but something inside him had started to shift. For the first time, he was seeing the entire moment as more than just a personal shock. It was a legal turning point. This wasn't just about a man who got angry. It was about a man who crossed a line, twice, and the system that would now respond. Joran Kale entered a moment later, still in uniform, holding a digital report. "Everything he's said lines up with witness accounts and cabin security logs. Braden ignored multiple warnings. And the punch." He glanced at Raylan's face and hesitated. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment lapse. It was targeted. "Thank you, Mr. Kale," Trask said, taking the report. "We'll use that for the formal charge submission." Raylan shifted, uncertain. "Am I going to have to see him again?" Delmore leaned forward, his voice gentler now. "That depends on the legal process. But based on what we've seen so far, your statement may be sufficient. If there's a hearing, it's up to you whether to attend." Raylan nodded slowly, not quite ready to decide. His hand moved in small circles across Milo's back, a silent rhythm that kept both of them grounded. Then one of the officers asked quietly, "Why didn't you ask for help earlier, when the man first glared at you or told you to stop?" "I thought—" Raylan's voice drifted for a moment. "I thought I was alone." It wasn't a dramatic statement. He didn't cry or shake. He just said it like a fact. But it froze everyone in place. Even the background hum of the air conditioner seemed to pause. Taryn stepped forward fully now and sat across from him. His eyes were calm, but sharp. "Danger doesn't wait for permission," he said, "but it also doesn't mean you have to face it alone." Raylan looked up at him, really seeing him. Not just the stranger from across the aisle, not even the man who had stopped Braden, but someone who had known what to do when everyone else was frozen. A moment later, the officers collected their papers and stepped out of the room to finalize the paperwork. Joran gave Raylan a nod and followed, leaving the teen and Taryn alone for a moment. Raylan leaned back slightly in his chair, Milo still pressed close. His arms ached, not from fatigue but from holding on too tightly for too long. And now that the worst had passed, the heaviness remained. Not fear, exactly, but the strange weight of being safe after being afraid. He closed his eyes briefly and let out the first real exhale since the plane had landed. The storm had passed, but its echoes still moved through every corner of his thoughts. The door opened with a swift hiss as Director Lauren Voss stepped into the small, private conference room. His presence carried immediate weight, not because of his uniform, but because of how still the room became when he entered. Raylan looked up from the chair where he held Milo, the infant now sleeping quietly against his chest, a thumb curled near his cheek. Taryn Vesk rose from his seat silently, offering the director a brief nod. Joran Kale, who stood near the corner, straightened with a quiet breath. Director Voss didn't waste time. "Raylan Ward," he said, voice firm but calm. "I want to thank you for the way you handled yourself today. What you endured, what you protected your brother from, could have ended very differently." Raylan blinked, unsure how to respond. I didn't know what else to do. I had to keep Milo safe." Voss stepped closer, pulling out the chair across from him. He didn't sit yet. "And you did, even while injured, even when others failed." His eyes swept toward Jorn for a moment, not in blame, but in acknowledgement of the crew's limitations. Terran remained silent but attentive, his gaze lingering on Raylan's face as though he already knew what was coming next. Director Voss finally sat, folding his hands in front of him on the table. "There's something you deserve to know, something that should have never been hidden from the crew. Or you." Raylan's chest tensed. Milo stirred slightly in his arms. "Brayden Kolst," Voss began, the name cutting through the air, "has a documented history of violent outbursts on commercial flights. 3 prior incidents. One resulted in a verbal warning, another in a gate delay. The third, it was flagged, but lost in a backlog of unresolved passenger reports." Jorn's jaw tensed. "That information never reached us on pre-boarding checks." "I know," Voss said, a note of frustration slipping into his voice. "It was a clerical error. Someone buried the report instead of escalating it. Our system failed you today, Raylan. That should never have happened." Raylan swallowed hard, adjusting Milo in his arms. "So, he wasn't just angry at me?" "No," Voss replied. "He was dangerous. And the truth is, if Terran hadn't been on board—" "He was a coincidence," Raylan interrupted softly, glancing at Terran. "Right." Terran leaned forward, meeting Raylan's eyes. "Not entirely." That silenced the room. Voss gestured for Terran to continue, and the man spoke evenly, calmly, like a man who measured each word. "I was off duty, but I've been tracking patterns of passenger aggression, especially repeat offenders slipping through the cracks. Brayden's name came up in a separate inquiry months ago, but without official authority on the flight I couldn't act, not until he made a clear threat." "And he did," Raylan whispered, the image of Brayden's fist searing back into his mind. "The moment he struck you," Terran confirmed, "the line was crossed." For a few seconds, the hum of the overhead lights was the only sound in the room. Milo stirred again, eyes fluttering open briefly before dozing off. Jorn stepped closer, his expression heavy. "If I had known." "You responded the moment you could," Terran said, cutting him off gently. "This wasn't on you, but it's on all of us to fix the cracks before someone falls through again." Director Voss nodded. "That's why we're changing the way our system works. Starting today, every documented incident, even if it doesn't lead to arrest, will trigger a visibility alert on future flights. Crew members will be notified discreetly. There won't be any more silencing repeat offenders through oversight." Raylan let out a long breath, both relieved and shaken. "All of this? Because of one song?" Voss shook his head. "No. All of this because one man thought his discomfort mattered more than another's safety." He stood again and placed a gentle hand on Raylan's shoulder. "You didn't provoke him. You protected your brother. That's what matters." A quiet knock came at the door, and a uniformed officer entered briefly, handing a packet to Voss and whispering something into his ear. Voss glanced at it, nodded, then turned back to Raylan. "This contains your rights, legal aid contacts, and medical assistance options. We'll have a transport ready for you and your brother shortly. You won't face this process alone." Raylan nodded slowly, processing everything: the hidden reports, Terran's presence, the reforms, and the strange way the world had tilted beneath his feet in just a few hours. "Thank you," he said softly. Jorn gave a small smile. "You handled yourself better than some adults I've seen in worse situations." Raylan didn't know what to say to that. He simply held Milo closer, thankful the baby was asleep and unaware of the storm that had nearly swallowed them both. As Director Voss turned to leave, he paused one last time at the door. What felt like a single violent moment was now revealed as part of a larger, hidden chain. The medic didn't ask many questions. He simply pressed the cold compress gently against Raylan's swollen cheek, nodded once, and said in a calm voice, "Keep this on for 10-minute intervals. No sharp pain in the jaw, right?" Raylan shook his head silently. The room was still, the air faintly sterile, and the only sound was Milo's soft breathing. The infant had finally fallen into a deeper sleep, nestled against Raylan's chest, his tiny fists curled into the fabric of his brother's shirt as if anchoring himself to safety. Raylan sat quietly on a firm leather couch in the airfield's private rest suite. The overhead light was dimmed, casting soft shadows on the white walls. A tray of untouched water bottles and prepackaged snacks sat on the side table, but he hadn't moved to touch anything. His arm cradled Milo instinctively, even now, long after the danger had passed. But his mind wasn't still. It ran like a loop, Braden's fist cutting the air, the sound of passengers gasping, the way Milo had screamed in terror. Every time he closed his eyes, it came back, as if his body refused to accept that it was over. The door clicked open. Taran Vesk stepped into the room quietly, his presence calm, grounded, as though nothing could shake him. He didn't speak at first. He simply sat in the chair opposite Raylan, elbows resting on his knees, clasped hands hanging between them. There was no badge visible now, no restraint device, just a man who had seen something and had stepped in. "You protected him," Taran said softly, nodding toward Milo. Raylan held Milo tighter. The baby trembled in his arms, his soft curls damp with sweat from crying. Raylan's heartbeat was a fast, painful echo in his ears. His jaw ached where the punch had landed, but his mind locked on one thing: protect Milo. Keep him safe. Stay between Braden and the baby, no matter what. "Sir," Joran said gently, looking to Taran with a nod before addressing Braden. "Please return to your seat. We've already informed the cockpit." Braden glanced down the aisle toward the cockpit. A small red light blinked near the cabin intercom panel, an alert signal. He shifted his weight, but the moment he twitched, Taran angled the restraint tool a fraction higher, enough to erase the idea. "Don't," Taran said. That one word, calm and unshaken, made Braden flinch more than any threat could have. Braden exhaled through clenched teeth and stepped back. It wasn't surrender. It was calculation. But it was enough. Joran moved alongside him as Braden backed into his row, settling into his seat like a man shackled by more than seatbelts. His expression was not one of guilt, it was of resentment. As if everyone around him had failed to see some imaginary insult only he understood. Passengers began breathing again. One man let out a quiet, "Thank God." Another woman dabbed her eyes, whispering something to herself. The cabin had returned to its artificial calm, but now it pulsed with the kind of energy that comes after a narrowly avoided disaster. Raylan leaned his head against Milo's, closing his eyes for a moment. The baby's cries had dulled to soft sobs, fingers clutching his brother's collar like a lifeline. Raylan whispered something, just a broken melody from the lullaby he had tried to sing before it all went wrong. His voice cracked midway, but he didn't stop. Taran took 2 steps back, still in the aisle but no longer threatening. He lowered the tool without holstering it, hand resting calmly over it like a silent warning. He didn't glance at Braden again. He didn't need to. He was watching everyone else now. The room, the balance, the possible sparks. Joran stepped forward, gently crouched by Raylan's seat. "Are you all right?" he asked, voice careful, not wanting to overwhelm. Raylan nodded, just barely. I think so." "Stay there. We've alerted the cockpit. We're preparing to divert." Joran's gaze flicked to the darkening bruise on Raylan's cheek. "You're doing everything right. Just hold him. That's all you need to do." Raylan didn't answer. He couldn't. The emotion was a rising tide in his throat. Across the aisle, Brayden sat stone-faced, hands on his knees, knuckles white. But his eyes were moving, measuring. Not regretful, not defeated. Watching. Taran caught it. He didn't speak it aloud, but the tension in his shoulders told the story. This wasn't over. As Joran walked briskly toward the front to coordinate with the captain, the soft hum of the intercom clicked on. A calm voice announced a temporary course change, due to a security concern. Passengers exchanged looks, some in hushed tones, but none challenged the decision. And in row 17, Raylan sat holding Milo beneath the air vent, a folded blanket draped loosely across the baby's back. Taran stood only a few feet away, like a shadow that didn't blink. Every movement from Brayden was watched. Every breath accounted for. There would be no third chance. And though the cabin seemed quiet again, something had shifted, permanently. The cabin had chosen sides, not with noise, not with votes, but with silence. And the silence was no longer neutral. The punch was only the beginning, and the consequences had just taken flight. Brayden's fist had barely left Raylan's cheek when the cabin plunged into a stunned, trembling silence. Now, moments later, the aftermath settled like a heavy fog. Brayden sat stiffly in his seat, jaw locked, breath shallow. His knuckles still bore the tension of the strike, though his posture suggested a forced calm, not remorse. Across the narrow aisle, Joran Kale stood close, not directly engaging Brayden, but keeping a watchful eye, his training evident in the subtle way he blocked any easy path forward. Just behind him, Taran Vesk remained stationed with the restraint tool lowered, but ready, like a sheath half drawn. Raylan hadn't moved far from the position Brayden's punch had knocked him into. He was cradling Milo tightly now, one arm wrapping around the infant's back, the other hand pressed gently against the baby's small head. His cheek pulsed with a dull ache that flared whenever he blinked. But he didn't cry, didn't speak. His entire focus was on Milo, who whimpered in hiccuping sobs against his chest. Raylan's voice cracked as he whispered, "It's okay. It's okay, buddy." Though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Milo or to himself. Taran Vesk stepped forward from the edge of the room. "Brayden Kolst. He's in custody now. 2 assaults, 1 witnessed by the entire cabin." His voice was steady but respectful. "Your son protected the baby first. That's all he cared about." Derek turned his gaze toward Taran and Joran, who now stood beside him. His voice cracked with emotion. "Thank you both. I don't even know how to. Thank you for being there." "You don't have to thank us," Joran said quietly. Raylan did what most adults wouldn't have had the presence to do. An officer entered with a folder in hand, clearing his throat. "Mr. Ward, Brayden Kolst is being processed now. Raylan won't have to face him again unless he chooses to attend the hearing. The charges include endangerment of a minor and assault with aggravating conditions. We've documented everything." Derek nodded sharply. "We'll be there, whatever it takes." The officer placed the file on the table beside them and exited without another word. A heavy silence followed, the kind that hangs after a storm when only the damage remains to be assessed. Raylan's fingers gently traced the soft curls at the top of Milo's head. He could still hear Brayden's voice, the violence, the swing of the arm, the weight of his own fear. And yet, Milo was here, safe, asleep. Director Laren Voss entered a moment later, his formal coat dusted with mist from the tarmac. "Mr. Ward," he said, extending a hand to Derek before turning to Raylan. "I owe you both an apology." Raylan blinked, unsure how to respond. Voss continued. "Brayden Kolst had a prior record, incidents on other flights, warnings, all mishandled due to clerical oversight, internal misfiling, fragmentation between systems. We should have caught it before he ever boarded that plane." Derek straightened. "You mean you knew what he was capable of?" "We do now," Voss said grimly, "and it won't happen again." He turned toward his assistant waiting outside the door and gestured. A tablet was handed to him. Voss held it up briefly. "As of 2 hours ago, we initiated a full rewrite of our passenger tracking protocol. Incidents will now follow the individual through a central database across all transport carriers in the region. Braden Kolst's name was the first one flagged." Raylan looked up slowly. "So, it's already changed?" "Partly because of you," Voss answered. "You kept your brother safe when it mattered. We didn't. Now we will." Taran stepped forward then, his eyes meeting Derek's. "There's something else you should know. I wasn't supposed to be on that flight officially, but I've been tracking behavioral patterns for flagged passengers as part of an internal assignment. Braden had crossed my radar months ago. I couldn't act until he posed a clear threat. When he struck Raylan, that became the trigger." Derek exhaled heavily, running a hand over his jaw. "So he was a walking danger, and my boys just happened to be near him when he exploded." "No," Taran said. "Your boys weren't near him. He walked into them." That small shift in phrasing silenced the room. Milo stirred then, rubbing his eyes with a soft grunt. He looked around, confused by the new faces. When he saw Derek, his small arms reached out instinctively, and Derek scooped him into a warm embrace. "You did good," he whispered into the baby's ear. Then to Raylan, his voice firmer, "You both did." Taran moved to the door, pausing for a moment. "This will go into the official record, but the real impact will be in the safeguards that follow. No guardian should be left to face that kind of threat alone." Derek stood, holding Milo, and gently placed a hand on Raylan's shoulder. "Let's go home, son." But Raylan didn't rise just yet. He remained seated, absorbing the moment, the change in air, the absence of Braden's shadow, the comfort of having his father back, Milo safe, and 2 men he barely knew standing up for him when it mattered most. He hadn't thrown a punch. He hadn't shouted or cursed. He had simply held on. And somehow, that had been enough. In the quiet, after the chaos, Raylan finally understood that survival can itself be an act of strength. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the ceiling vent and the occasional rustle of paper. Raylan Ward sat stiffly at the long oak table, Milo curled in his arms, fast asleep. The bruising on Raylan's cheek had darkened into deep violet shadows, a physical reminder of what he had endured, but his posture was straight, his expression alert. Across the table, Director Laren Vos sat reviewing a document, his fingers folded neatly beneath his chin. Beside him sat Taran Vesk, hands clasped calmly, eyes scanning the room. Jorn Kale leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, his quiet loyalty emanating from every movement. "This isn't a debriefing," Director Voss began, breaking the silence. His voice was even, respectful. "This is recognition." Raylan blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected praise. He hadn't even expected to be invited. The last week had been a blur of sleepless nights, aching ribs from guarding Milo too tightly, and answering questions from security, press, and his father, who still checked on him every hour. But this meeting felt different. Formal, yes, but not cold. There was something building here, something that didn't have to do with punishment or damage control. It felt like a beginning. "You kept your brother safe in a moment that could have gone much worse," Voss continued. "You stayed calm. You didn't escalate. And most importantly, you held the line when many adults might not have." Raylan didn't know what to say. His throat tightened, but he gave a small nod and looked down at Milo, whose tiny hand was curled around a fold of his shirt. He remembered singing that lullaby on the plane, how the soft melody had started everything, how something meant to soothe had drawn fury from a stranger. Director Voss stood and clicked a small remote. A screen lit up behind him, displaying a name in bold silver letters: The Ward Protocol. Raylan froze. His eyes locked on the screen. "That's me?" he asked quietly, voice cracking at the edge. "It is," Voss said. "The ward protocol is being introduced today. It will mandate specific protections for guardians traveling with infants and small children. That includes automatic alerts when a known aggressive passenger is booked on the same flight. It includes immediate cabin crew escalation procedures, and, most importantly, it includes training on recognizing the warning signs before a punch is thrown." Joran leaned forward now. "It's more than policy. It's a safeguard for the next father, brother, or teen trying to do the right thing." Raylan felt heat behind his eyes but held it in. He didn't want to cry, not in front of these men. Not now. He wasn't sure if the emotion was pride or exhaustion, but it rolled in his chest like a tide. Taran Vesk spoke next. His voice was lower, almost reflective. "Sometimes, the things we endure become anchors for change, but it takes someone to endure them with grace. That's what you did, Raylan." There was silence for a beat, then Voss gestured gently toward him. "We'd like to ask you something. Not for the record, just as a human moment." Raylan tilted his head, unsure. "Sing," Voss said. "Sing the lullaby. The one from the plane." At first, Raylan hesitated. His voice had felt like a weapon to Braden. Something offensive. Something worth silencing. But here, now, it felt like the very opposite. Slowly, cautiously, he adjusted Milo in his arms, placing one hand gently on his back. Then, with a breath he didn't realize he was holding, he began. The same low hum. The soft rise and fall. The sound that had once filled the pressurized cabin with calm. It was not loud, it wasn't perfect, but it was pure. No one interrupted. No one shifted in their seat. No one spoke. When the melody ended, the silence that followed was fuller than applause. It carried the weight of respect. Joran nodded once, lips pressed tightly in a mix of approval and something more personal. Something that said he had seen too many flights end in silence for the wrong reasons. Taran looked as if he had been transported back to the moment he first stood in that aisle with the restraint tool in his hand, drawing a line Braden couldn't cross. And Voss, ever the bureaucrat, let his hands fall to the table slowly, a thoughtful smile breaking through his usual formality. "You turned a moment of violence into something lasting," Voss said. "That lullaby. It will outlive the punch." Raylan looked down at Milo, who stirred gently in his arms, his breath even, safe. He stood, nodded respectfully, and thanked each man in turn. The moment felt surreal, but grounded. This wasn't about ceremony. It was about meaning. As Raylan stepped out of the building, the late afternoon sun spilled gold across the tarmac. His father, Derek, waited just beyond the glass doors, arms open, smile wide. Milo woke, blinked at the sky, and then leaned into his brother's chest again. They walked together down the quiet path between buildings, the shadow of the airfield stretching far behind them. Ahead, the world looked a little less sharp, a little less cruel. Raylan whispered to Milo, his voice soft, almost carried away by the breeze. "No matter how frightening the skies become, we'll always find a way through together." And in that quiet promise between brothers, the story found its lasting peace. Seconds later, the father acted, neutralizing the threat instantly, leaving the passenger frozen and the crew stunned. The click was the warning, and authority responded without hesitation. If you believe real power strikes decisively, with preparation and unstoppable force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores arrogance, abuse of authority, and the consequences of underestimating someone. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage accountability, respect, and integrity in all situations.